Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at a more affordable X570 motherboard from Gigabyte. This is the X570 Aorus Elite, which is pretty close to like well, it's the third from the bottom of their motherboard lineup, which I think they only have like 6 or 7 motherboards in total, so that doesn't really make much of a difference. But anyway, yeah, so we are taking a look at this. This is one of the cheaper X570 motherboards. I am not sure, like, I don't know that I can reveal prices yet, so yeah, but this is probably like this board is not aimed well. It'll run the 16 core just fine. It's just not necessarily aimed at people considering a $750 CPU.
Before that, this video is brought to you by Dollar Shave Club and their starter sets. Get your Dollar Shave Club starter set for $5 by using our link below, available individually for shave, shower, or oral care, or all together in one package. The kits can be customized to your needs with options including toothpaste and a toothbrush, hydrating shampoo, face cleanser and scrubs, body wash, or a razor with cartridges and shaving cream. Convenience is key, and care packages can be scheduled to send when you need a restock. Go to dollarshaveclub.com/gamersnexus or click the link below to learn more.
Anyway, things worth noting. This socketed BIOS chip is just a part of this being an ES motherboard, so this is an engineering sample, which is also like why this is missing right here. So on the retail board, you will not have a socketed BIOS chip, so you'll have just a single BIOS right there. And yes, this is a Gigabyte board with single BIOS instead of dual BIOS. I'm not sure if that's a cost-saving thing or if that's just because I've complained to them on multiple occasions about how stupid their dual BIOS system is when, you know, it will randomly hop from one BIOS chip to the other. So, yeah, like that gets really annoying if you're overclocking. And people who use Gigabyte motherboards know exactly what I'm talking about, or have experienced it and don't even know what's causing it. And so, yeah, but it's super annoying. Basically, you lose all of your settings at random, and it's really not fun. So that might be part of why this board, like on their higher end boards, they still have dual BIOS, but they also give you like BIOS switches. On their lower end boards, I guess they just kind of decided instead of putting BIOS switches, we'll just throw the BIOS chip out, the extra BIOS chip out completely. Anyway, the board does have Q flash functionality, so you can update the BIOS of the motherboard without even having a CPU installed, which is really useful if you had, like, if you know, if you're buying the board and there's a new CPU out that it doesn't support yet, but X570 is launching along the Ryzen 3000 series lineup, so that feature will only really be useful like next year if we see another generation of CPU, like another wave of CPUs for the X570 chipset. There's no debug features of any kind anywhere on this motherboard. There's no debug LEDs. There's no postcode. So I mean, the speaker I think is still present. So you know, if you want your motherboard to beep at you, you do still have that option. But you know, the in my opinion, more pleasant troubleshooting features are not present on this board because it is, you know, kind of at the bottom of the lineup from Gigabyte. So boards above this actually do include troubleshooting LEDs. This one doesn't. Anyway, so with that out of the way, let's get into the VRM, because that is something where I don't really have any complaints, because Gigabyte has, like, the funny thing is, if you have, like, Gigabyte's AM4 lineup for say X470 and B450 is you have the X470 Gaming 7, which is a really good motherboard, and then you have everything under it, and that's bad. Like, and I'm not joking about that. Like, you've got the Gaming 7, and then everything under it is bad. In my opinion, you should not consider those motherboards. But since then, Gigabyte has done a complete 180. And so even something like the X570 Elite right here, the Aorus Elite right here, actually has a really solid VRM. So you've got a 12-phase V-core. Because, like, so right off the bat, this VRM is more powerful than the VRM you get on the Gaming 7, the X470 Gaming 7. So 12-phase V-core and a plus 2-phase SoC. So pretty standard on the SoC VRM right here, because obviously, like, this wouldn't necessarily be ideal for, like, powering an APU if you're into, like, heavy APU overclocking, which I'm a huge fan of. It's super fun if you're into overclocking things for the sake of overclocking things. Maxing out APUs is really, really fun. They scale great. But This board's obviously not meant for that. This is meant for more like a 3900X, a 3950X, 3800X, 3700X, right? Really, some of the higher end Ryzen 3rd gen CPUs. And so it just goes with a two-phase SoC VRM because you don't really need anything more than that for powering the SoC. The voltage controller used is an ISL 69138. 69138, which is a 7-phase voltage controller, and Gigabyte is running it in a 6+1 phase configuration. Now, this is like the highest end voltage controller that Intersil makes, so it's really, really good. Like this is the same voltage controller you'd see on something like the X299 OC Formula from ASRock, the X299 Dark from EVGA, the X299... trying to remember, not X299. There's a bunch of other X299 boards that use it. I think even from Gigabyte, it's just that I've not really been paying attention to that side of their motherboard lineup. And then there's the Z390 Dark, also uses the ISL 69138. So this is a very popular chip for high-end motherboards because it's basically the latest and greatest you can get from Intersil. Anyway, it's running as a 6+1 phase, and to achieve the 12-phase configuration for vCore here, Gigabyte is, of course, using a bunch of doublers. So you have doubler 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So these are all Intersil, and GIMP is freaking out for, like, it's been doing this today. I don't know why. I don't really care. So yeah, these are all ISL 6617s. And what's special about the ISL 6617 as a doubler is that it can actually current balance, which is not something you get on all doublers. So basically what this means is the ISL 6617 monitors the current going through each of the phases that it's connected to, and it will do PWM pulse extensions for whichever phase is handling less current in order to get the current balance more optimal between the two phases. The reason why you want this is it will give you slightly better efficiency than if you have a dumb doubler that doesn't do that at all. Because ideally you want the current spread evenly across all of your phases as well, or as evenly as possible. So yeah, these actually do that on their own. The one downside to running doublers is that you do have slightly, well, you basically get a bit of delay on your PWM signal, which leads to slightly worse transient response, though it also depends on how the rest of your VRM is designed, as there's other things you can do to try improve the transient response to negate the side effects of running doublers. And also, depending on how much impact the doublers actually have on your transient response, it might not even matter in the grand scheme of things, right? That's another thing, is if you have only a couple millivolts difference between a doubled scheme and a not doubled scheme, well, you're not going to notice that because it's 10 millivolts on a transient. Like, that's not something that a CPU really sees on the regular. So yeah, I'm a fan of the control scheme that Gigabyte's going for here. It's really like you're not going to get 12 phases on a motherboard at this price point any other way. Like the high phase count voltage controllers from like Infineon, the XDP 132G5C, it's just too damn expensive. You're not going to use it. Yeah, like even factoring the cost of all the doublers into the cost along with the cost of the 69138, like the new 16 phase controllers from Infineon just cost more than that. So yeah, that's what's going on with the control scheme. For the actual power stages, we're looking at SIC 634s from Intersil. And these are 50 amp DR MOS components, so we're not going to go up there because that's all red. DR MOS. This is actually the same power state. Like, so fun fact, this is actually basically the exact same VRM that you would get on a ASRock X570 Taichi motherboard, except that this uses the ISL 69138, whereas ASRock is using the ISL 69147. There's not really much of a difference between the two. The 69147, I think, is just a little bit cheaper because it's an AMD specific chip, though I've not checked that. Or it might have some new AMD features on it, because like this is a chip that's been around for a while, and it does evidently support AMD's voltage regulator standard because Gigabyte is using it on an AMD motherboard. It's just that, yeah, ASRock is using a variant, like a very similar chip to this that doesn't work on Intel. Like, that's the biggest difference with the 69147 is 147 is that, yeah, that one doesn't work on Intel. This one works on both Intel and AMD. Not really a huge difference, but on the Taichi, you get the same power stages, you get the same phase count, you get the same doublers. So, except I'm not sure what the Taichi costs compared to this board. So that's kind of, yeah, so like this could potentially be, like VRM wise, this is potentially really good value for like really good performance for the cost of the board. So anyway, let's take a look at the VRM efficiency here. Oh, and I forgot to mention, so DRMOS stands for driver MOSFET. These are dumb. So they're a type of power stage. They're like the dumbest type of power stage you can have. The oldest power stage standard, if I'm not mistaken, because they're literally just a driver IC along with two MOSFETs, which is like the bare minimum you need to build a power stage. And I call them dumb because if you look at a lot of other power stages, they'll include things like current monitoring or temperature monitoring. And then if you get the really smart power stages, they'll not only monitor the current, they'll also shut down when the current gets too high for safe long-term operation and that kind of. So you'll have like overcurrent protection and like other protections built into the actual power stages themselves directly. Whereas with these, I mean, like you have to implement your current monitoring as an external circuit. You need to implement your temperature monitoring as another external just component somewhere. Right. So yeah, that's the difference between DRMOS and something like a POW-IR stage from International Rectifier, or a smart power stage, which is the new Intel voltage regulator standard, which includes a whole bunch of like extra monitoring requirements, which DRMOS is also an Intel voltage regulator standard, if I'm not mistaken, like from like 2004 or something. So it is really old. Anyway, so for operating parameters of 1.2 volts out and 300 kilohertz switching frequency, along with 5 volts drive, because that is what these power stages run on. We're going to be looking at the following kind of heat output from the VRM for the current output. So at 100 amps current output, this VRM will produce about 10 watts of heat, which quite frankly, you shouldn't even need a heatsink for that. Then for 150 amps output, it'll produce about 16 watts of heat, which at this point a heatsink is necessary, is probably a good idea. But you don't need like airflow or anything. This is roughly around the current draw that you would expect from a maxed out 12-core Ryzen running like Prime 95, so P95. Then going up to 200 amps, which is, well, at 200 amps, this VRM will produce about 24 watts of heat. This is the current draw that like the 16-core completely maxed out would pull in Prime 95. So that's maxed out as in overclocked, not as in stock settings running Prime 95. Because if you're running stock settings, if you're running Prime 95 on stock settings, it'll throttle down to somewhere around the 100 amp figure, maybe below that, maybe slightly above that, but it won't be anywhere near 200 amps. So yeah, at stock, you probably wouldn't need a VRM heatsink whatsoever. At heavy overclocks on the 12-core or 16-core, this VRM will handle that just fine with the heatsink that it comes with. Even though they do have this lovely airflow restrictor right next to the VRM heatsink, like it does. Well, if you look up photos of the motherboard, then the heatsink looks something like that, and it's substantial. It's not the highest surface area heatsink I've ever seen, but at the same time, this is also quite this is a pretty efficient VRM, and it's not like you have all 12 phases dumping all of their heat into the heatsink right here. You have 3 phases up here that also put heat into the heatsink on the top edge of the motherboard, and that just reduces the amount of work that this heatsink has to do in terms of cooling. So yeah, I don't like this. Honestly, like if like this VRM is great. Like honestly, you don't need anything more powerful than this, if you'd ask me. The board even has the single 8-pin. Like the only thing I would really complain about on this motherboard is that, yeah, it's single BIOS. There's no postcode. There's no troubleshooting at LEDs. Those are like my main complaints for this motherboard. The VRM right here, like as I said, Gigabyte did a 180. It's just like it used to be that they had some of the very worst designs, and now it's like, well, this right here, you've got a, like, again, well, I can't, I'm not sure I can share the price point, but like for the price out of the boards that I've seen, this looks really good. So yeah, like as far as I'm concerned, this is great. Anyway, Going up into unreasonable current draw levels, like 300 amps, which would be like, say, liquid nitrogen overclocking on the 16 core or something, which I wouldn't recommend this motherboard for because, like, the big things for me are, like, the no postcode, no debug LEDs, but there's also going to be things missing that are actually important for extreme overclocking, like some of the minor voltage rails that you have to tune for cold boot bugs and cold bugs and better overclocking on liquid nitrogen. There's, like, a whole bunch of weird stuff that happens when you take silicon really cold. That you need to compensate for with extra voltage in areas of the CPU that normally don't scale with voltage at all. Like this board's not going to have those. So, you know, this is purely a theoretical thing, but just to give you an idea of how good the VRM is. So 300 amps output, this VRM would produce about 44 watts of heat, which that is actually a lot of heat. And you do, like, this depends on how good your heatsink system is and also how much airflow it's getting. So yeah, the board's obviously not designed for this. If you look at what it's the actual heatsinks that it comes with, like you'd need to get a pretty high RPM fan sitting over the VRM for this to be viable for long-term loads. But at the same time, as I just said, like the 16 core is going to max out at around 200 amps. So that's not really something you need to worry about. And then going up to 400 amps, it's just, I'm comparing, like, the thing is, for a lot of the other more ridiculous X570 motherboards, this is actually a totally doable current output, like, no problem. So going up to 400 amps, that's where I think this motherboard just, yeah, like, that's not, like, at this point, you're talking, like, custom water cooling for the VRM to keep it at acceptable temperatures. Then going all the way up to 500 amps, 86 watts of heat, better water cool. Well, actually, water cooling is so ridiculously overpowered that it would probably take care of these two the same, about equally well. Like you wouldn't really notice much of a temperature difference between 71 watts and 86 watts, depending on how much surface area your VRM water block has. But yeah, this is obviously not what the board's designed for. So for current draws where Ryzen would actually run, this VRM is absolutely great. Like you can't. You get a 12 phase, you got your 50 MDR MOS, like what more could you really want? Well, what more could you really need? I mean, you could get international rectifier, which might have some, well, Inter still technically supports everything IR supports. It's just like, I don't know how well it's implemented by the board vendors. So I'd be very surprised if you noticed a major difference in overclocking between this board and some of the higher end boards just from the VRM standpoint. What you would notice is like, oh, the other boards have a postcode, which if you're doing memory overclocking is super nice to have because it helps you troubleshoot a lot of boot up errors, whereas this doesn't really have anything. But yeah, like VRM wise, I mean, you know, if Gigabyte took this VRM and stuck with it all the way through their entire lineup, I still wouldn't really complain about it. It's just that they decided for the higher end boards they're gonna go with even slightly better designs. Now then, for the capacitors, Gigabyte is using a bunch of APAC capacitors, which are really popular with both Gigabyte and Asus for their lower end boards. This is a Taiwanese capacitor manufacturer, and these are all aluminum polymers, so these inherently just last for kind of forever. They don't, like, unlike, say, liquid electrolyte aluminum capacitors, these don't blow up because there's no liquid in them to, like, expand. So yeah, these last for ages. The main thing with them is that over time, as they degrade, they basically fail open. So it acts like there's no capacitors, but that takes many years. And these are still rated for 5,000 hours at 105 degrees Celsius. So, you know, I wouldn't, like, it's not Japanese capacitors, but I wouldn't stress out about this because, like, these are fine. Also, this VRM won't run hot enough that the temperature rating of the capacitor should really be much of a concern anyway, especially if you're not on like a 12 core or something. This VRM is going to be running ice cold. So yeah, it's like at that point, you know, the capacitors really will last way longer because they're going to be just running so much cooler. And we have the same on the back here. We do have only a single 8-pin, which is fine because a single 8-pin can handle 384 watts. Motherboards with more than, like, there's a bunch of low-end motherboards with like an 8-pin and a 4-pin. That does not make them better because a single 8-pin can already completely, well, you know, okay, it's not going to be 1.2 volts for that 200 amp figure, but you're not hitting 384 watts on a Ryzen 16 core on Prime, not even on Prime 95 with like water cooling. Okay, maybe on liquid nitrogen, this might be a problem. But for day-to-day overclocking, this is perfectly fine. I have no complaints there. And then the SoC VRM, we're looking at so this is the only place where I really would complain about the VRM, but the thing is, this does only, like, if you're running with this board's meant for CPUs, not APUs, right? Like, why would you pair an X570 board, which is rather expensive, with an APU? This is like the only place where I could say, like, yeah, Gigabyte's not going with top of the line VRM components because they're just going with the usual. So they have a high side MOSFET, just discrete MOSFETs, and these are Gigabyte's favorite. And these are MOSFETs that I rip on a lot in some of my videos because they're not great. The thing is like, you don't need a great MOSFET if you don't have to handle any power, right? Like, you need to choose your components to fit the job. Not like, you're not going to use a 70 amp freaking power stage for memory power, because that's a waste of 70 amp power stages. DDR4 doesn't need that much current capability. Anyway, so you have a 4C10N from On Semiconductor for the high side and a 4C06N for the low side. There's another high side and low side MOSFET on the back of the board, which is done for just basically better current handling because, so you have a high side here and another high side there and another low side there and another low side there. So this does actually increase the current capability of each of the phases, and this is perfectly fine for just powering the CPUs, which is what this board is going to be doing with this SoC VRM. Well, for powering the SoC of the various CPUs. So yeah, that's what's going on with that. The memory topology is a daisy chain. So Gigabyte is going with daisy chain for their entire X570 motherboard lineup. I am not sure how it will support. So daisy chain biases towards 2x8 configurations. So this will generally give you, and like the thing is, 2x8 is generally the most overclockable configuration, regardless of like, well, no, T topology will often run better on 4x8, depending on how good the memory controller of the CPU is as well. But 2x8 is what's optimal for this motherboard, like definitely where you're going to hit the highest speeds with this motherboard, and that would be on this DIMM slot and that DIMM slot because of the way daisy chain works, because it basically hits one slot and then the next. You can actually see that on the back of the board, but I've shown that in other videos, so, you know, I'm not going to go over that. For higher density capacities, 2x16 single rank might actually, or should also, well, higher capacities are a big no idea for me, because I know for a fact that already on X470 daisy chain boards can do 3200 megahertz on 4x8 just fine. They can also do 3200 on 2x16. So with Ryzen 3000, I don't know how the memory controllers improved. I don't know how the BIOSes of the motherboards have improved. So there's a good chance that 2x16 and 4x8 might have very little difference between them, or 2x16 is just vastly superior, or 2x16 is terrible because the DIMMs are all, like, the 2x16 dual rank could be terrible, while 2x16 single rank could be amazing. Really depends on too many factors to really make a judgment for higher capacities. I would say you'd have to wait for like motherboard QVLs to basically come out, because the board vendors, they do a lot of memory testing. And so I would just check the QVLs for what kind of memory configurations they've tested, and if you see, and then sort of try pick and choose a memory kit based on that. You don't need to choose an exact QVL memory kit most of the time. You just need to pick something that's similar to what they've already tested and validated as working. So yeah, 2x16, I'm not sure if it's going to be better than 4x8. And then if you're going up for like 64 gigs of RAM, I'd say 2x32 is a pretty good bet to be better than 4x16, because 4x16 just, well, it could run into the same issue as a 2x16 versus 4x8, depending on which memory ICs you're looking at. And then 4x32, you can just kind of forget about memory clock speed, because that's just way too much damn RAM. The memory controller is going to hate you for that. Anyway, so that's kind of the memory overclocking here. The memory VRM is just the usual Gigabyte standard RT8120 with a high side, low side, and low side MOSFET. So this is a single phase memory VRM right here. This works fine. They use the same VRM all the way up to the X570 Xtreme, because DDR4 doesn't really pull enough power, and it really is much more about what you do with your memory trace layout than it is about what you do with your memory VRM over here. Like a good single phase can, do plenty in terms of DDR4 overclocking, because DDR4 just doesn't pull that much power. On the other hand, you can have a 3-phase memory VRM, and if your trace layout is crap, the whole motherboard's memory overclocking capabilities are also going to be crap. So yeah, I'm not going to complain about this. And this is this is just more 4C10N MOSFETs from On Semiconductor, which again, it's fine. Like DDR4 doesn't pull that much power. There's definitely going to be some motherboards where the DDR4 VRM might run a little bit cooler, but this is not going to overheat either. Like this is really not an issue. So yeah, it's not the most efficient. It's just like, it's going to be a couple degrees. You don't need to worry about it. Quite frankly, I don't know why I even cover this VRM. I should just consider it the same way I consider the chipset VRM irrelevant. It's like, it doesn't do anything for overclocking anyway, but yeah. So yeah, that's the X570 Aorus Elite from Gigabyte. You get, like, it's a really barren motherboard in terms of like sort of features, right? You get your Q flash, you get a single BIOS chip. You don't really get any troubleshooting features on the board. You get, you know, the bare minimum of the PCIe slots that X570 really supports. So you have your one X16 right here from the CPU, and then you have your one X4 from the chipset. So that goes over there. This goes over there. Yeah, that's really all there is to the board. But you do get a really solid VRM, and it is you know, one of the cheaper X570 motherboards out there. So it's going to be a really, really solid option. Especially if if you don't care about having, like, I personally would find the postcode basically a deal breaker, or the lack of any troubleshooting LEDs a deal breaker. But yeah, you know, if you don't care about that kind of thing, this is a really, really solid motherboard. Yeah, at least in terms of like the VRM. In terms of features, you'll have to decide for yourself. So that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support Gamers Nexus, then you can support us directly through Patreon, or you can buy Gamers Nexus merch on store.gamersnexus.net. You know, there's like, what is there? Shirts, mod mats, that kind of thing. Yeah, and that obviously helps out immensely with the channel. So yeah, and one last thing I wanted to mention is I have a channel called Actually Hardcore Overclocking, where I do more motherboard PCB breakdowns and other overclocking related stuff. So if you like overclocking, you could go check that out. So yeah, because I post other videos. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.